I was born on March 20th, 1910. Throughout my boyhood and young manhood, I strove to be as much like Admiral Togo as possible, especially in physical accomplishment and stamina. So, I think, did every other Kagoshima boy. Togo's father was a samurai, who gave his son an extremely Spartan example to emulate. The younger samurai excelled not only in studies, but in fencing, swimming, sumo wrestling, hiking, and mountain climbing. When he was only 17, he helped fight off a British force that shelled Kagoshima in reprisal for the killing of 2 Englishmen near Yokohama. Togo enlisted in Shimazu's navy at 19 and fought in 2 naval battles not long afterward. When he was 26, the national government sent him to England, where he studied the ways of a modern fleet. His victory over the Russians on May 27, 1905, at Tsushima Strait, northwest of Kyushu, electrified the world, especially the Japanese people. Suddenly Japan, in less than 40 years, had leapt forward 400 years. In 1867, her warriors wore suits of armour and fought with swords. In 1905, they crouched over telescopic gun sights in steel turrets, mounted in ships so superior that British newspapers complained that British shipyards built better ships for foreigners than for the Royal Navy. The victory also affected other Asians deeply, for this was the first victory over white men in that part of the world. All this was a great source of pride to the stern, tough people of Togo's hometown. It affected every activity of my youth. Each day, after grammar school classes, I went with my schoolmates, all boys, to a club. There, in an effort to be like Admiral Togo, I studied, debated, and learned from older persons about our traditions, while competing with others in fencing, judo, and sumo. The samurai spirit was high in us as we voluntarily performed close order drill. We talked much about how a Japanese should be brave, be courteous, and be simple in his living habits. Once a year, the Imperial Combined Fleet would come to Kagoshima and anchor in the broad bay. Swarms of people would go out to visit it. When I was 11 years old, the mighty battleship Mutsu was its flagship, and I was much impressed with the shining brasswork, the gleaming steel decks, and the immaculate messing and berthing spaces. It was a great thrill for a young boy to see those officers and sailors move briskly about their duties. I visited the very peak of the forecastle, the tip of the battleship's bow, and laid my hand on the gilded chrysanthemum carried there, the symbol of Imperial Japan. At that moment, I made myself a promise. "Some day, Zenji," I told myself, "you are going to serve in the Imperial Navy. You will be a crew member of this mighty ship, and you will again lay your hand on this glorious symbol." I was still a student in grammar school when some war-booty German submarines were exhibited at Kagoshima. My teacher visited one and actually made a dive in it. He told us many stories about that adventure and of what the German submarines had accomplished before their nation was defeated. This and the visit to Mutsu made me feel strongly that I wanted a Navy career. 2 other boys in my class were similarly influenced, Taro Ebihara, son of a retired rear admiral, and Shigeshi Kuriyama, son of a pharmacist. CDR Ebihara died on board a destroyer in the fighting for the Solomons. Litger Kuriyama gave his life while skippering RQ-33, just about the time I put RO-101 in commission. I moved up to Kagoshima's middle school in 1922, a step that made my parents very proud. It was located in Kajiya-cho near Shimazu's castle. Only top students could enter this school, which had a reputation for scholarship going back 50 years to the Restoration period. Discipline was tight, the course difficult, and the athletic program very strenuous. I did pretty well in my studies, but actually excelled in sports. Included in the curriculum, which was much influenced by the samurai spirit universal among Kagoshima people, was military training, supervised by a pair of retired army officers. Under them was a major who inspired all of us, though he was very tough. He maintained high standards, demanded high performance, and talked often about the importance of both. The Washington Naval Disarmament Treaty of 1922 had caused Japan, like other nations, to make a radical reduction in the student bodies of its military and naval academies. "That is why now is the best possible time," this man would say to us many times, "for you to enter the military life. Before many years pass, men from the two academies will be the leaders of Japan's military forces, and those forces will again be much larger than they are now." Many years later, I would command a submarine rushing to this man's aid at Okinawa. There, American Marines and Army troops would learn what a strong and disciplined fighter he was, and pay for this lesson in rivers of blood. His name was Mitsuru Ushijima, his rank then Lieutenant General. Because the Kagoshima district was so poor, few boys could get higher educations. So it was everyone's dream to win admission to the military or naval academy. Few from Kagoshima got into the military academy, which got the bulk of its cadets from Yamaguchi Prefecture, an area strongly inclined toward army life, but many were successful from near my home, an area with a long sea tradition, at getting into the Naval Academy. In January 1928, I took the entrance examination for Itajima, Japan's Annapolis. Over 4,000 boys throughout Japan, all holding high academic standing, competed for the 130 appointments. Unlike the US, where most appointments are obtained through political influence, our academy was open to every boy in the land. Requirements were a good character, attested to by several prominent citizens, a high level of physical fitness, and a high academic standing. No one who wore glasses was considered at all, nor were men who had more than a couple of teeth missing. There was but one exception to the rules. Members of the royal family could enter, provided they passed the physical examination. They did not have to take the other tests, and some members of the royal family did matriculate at Etajima, including Prince Takamatsu, brother of the emperor. The physical examination was most meticulous, the written one very severe. There were tests on 8 different academic subjects, and the entire proceedings took a week. Then we all went home, nervous and irritable. All 4,000 candidates must have been impossible to live with during the next 2 months while they waited for the results. In spite of the tension, I enjoyed basking in the new attention given me locally. About 150 boys from Kagoshima took the examination that year, which in itself was a great honor. I found myself thinking that at least I had been allowed to take it, which would be some consolation should I fail to gain entrance. Then, in March of 1929, 17 other boys and myself received word that we had been selected. My back was very stiff with pride on April 4, 1929, as I entered Etajima, my new blue uniform as yet unwrinkled, a short sword at my side. I was in the 59th class. While Annapolis men are marked by the year in which they are graduated, Japanese men used the graduating class number. My class was to be the 59th to complete the course, and I would ever after be a 59th man. On my first Sunday at Etajima, an instructor marched all 130 of us to the top of Mount Furutaka, which rose 1,000 feet behind the academy. As we stood on its crest and looked north, we could see Hiroshima. To the east was the great naval arsenal at Kure, black plumes of smoke rising from its shops. Below us lay the academy compound, and on the water between our island school and the mainland lay countless moored ships. I can still recall my main thought on that day, how the scene before me seemed divided between the artificial and the natural, the man-made ships and the lovely pine trees, sea and grass. Then I buckled down to months of arduous schooling. Our day began at 5:30 a.m. and ended at 10 p.m., with little time spared for leisure. Our subjects included the Japanese language, mathematics, electronics, machinery engineering, astronomy, oceanology, and others. In addition, we had the special naval subjects of gunnery, torpedoes, navigation, communications, and engineering. The English language was a required subject for every midshipman, and we also had to study one other foreign language as well. I chose French. There were 3 classes, the 57th, 58th and 59th in the academy when I started there, having about 120–130 midshipmen in each. We were organised both horizontally and vertically. The 59th, for example, was split into 4 divisions. I lived, ate, slept and studied with mine. There were, of course, 12 such in the academy, giving horizontal organisation within our own graduating groups. Vertical organisation was accomplished by dividing each class into 12 sections, a section of one class, say the 59th, being combined with sections of the 57th and 58th for all extra academic activities. Thus, a man in Class 59, Division 1, Section 1, went to class with Division 1 men, but when it came time for athletics, he participated with Section 1 men of the upper classes. This gave good balance and made sports highly competitive. It also helped men to become acquainted with those senior to them at an early date, rather than be segregated from them for 3–2 years, then have to meet them for the first time on active duty. Meals were simple. So were accommodations. We had one general sleeping room and one general study room for every 30 cadets or so. All midshipmen ate in one general mess hall, which had much room to spare because classes had been so reduced in number. Our only really free times were Saturday afternoons and from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. on Sundays. The 2 half-hours we had free during the rest of the week were usually given over to some extra needed study. We could leave the compound on Sundays and go into the town of Etajima, but there was no kind of diversion there at all. No stores, no tea-houses or restaurants where a midshipman might want to shop or relax. What we did have there were clubs. The Welfare and Morale Department of the Academy arranged that the use of one was obtained for 30 midshipmen. We could lie around on tatami mats, play records, take naps, or stuff ourselves with sukiyaki. It seems strange, looking back over the decades, that I ever could stand such a Spartan life. Later, when I learned of it, I marvelled at how Annapolis men could have girlfriends and dates and dances, and sometimes a weekend of fun and pleasure. A 3-week winter holiday and a 4-week summer holiday was all the time we had off away from the academy. And even then, one's behaviour had to be most circumspect. A Japanese officer was socially acceptable anywhere, a most unusual thing in class-stratified Japan. It was a great honour to be one, or even training to be one, so one's manners and conduct had to be above reproach at all times. Our family backgrounds, even before taking the competitive entrance examination, had been checked by the police. Becoming involved in some form of forbidden behaviour, even while on vacation, could mean immediate expulsion and disgrace. This was a very rare happening, however. Maintaining high standards of conduct was a challenge, as were other things at Ayajima, like the annual boat race and annual swimming race. It gave me pride to see 360 young bodies pulling at oars for all they were worth. And at Miyajima, where we had our annual 10-day camp-out just before summer vacation, the men who were not good swimmers would spend practically all of each day in the water so they could build enough stamina and skill to complete the 10,000-metre swimming race that ended the stay. Of the men who failed to graduate from Itajima, only a handful flunked scholastically. Most failures came from breakdowns in health because of our rigorous physical training. A great deal of our leisure discussion at Itajima, naturally, centred about sea life. At the start of my summer vacation in 1931, I decided to stop off at the Kure Naval Arsenal to see some of the real Navy. Midshipman Zenshin Toyama went along with me. We were welcomed gracefully and given a tour of the submarine school. In one corner of the grounds, Toyama and I saw an old-style submarine on rests. It was submarine number 6, recovered from Hiroshima Bay after sinking there on April 14, 1910. Beside it, encased in glass, was the final will of Lieutenant Tsutomi Sakuma, captain of the tiny submersible, written while he was waiting to die. For 20 years he had been the inspiration of Japan's small but growing submarine fleet. Japan first thought of getting submarines for its navy at the same time as America did. On March 14, 1900, when Mr. John Holland demonstrated his underseas boat for ADM, George Dewey, and other notables, a naval member of the Japanese embassy's staff was present. He was much impressed and at once recommended to Tokyo that Japan purchase some of these boats. On April 11, 1904, the US accepted USS Holland, SS-1, and 15 months later the first Japanese submarine performed excellently on its first sea trials, amazing the Americans who came along to provide technical assistance. They had not expected our men to master the submarine so quickly. Our government bought 5 of Mr. Holland's boats, plus the plans for 2 improved models. At that time, Japan had 7 fine foreign-built battleships and 15 fine foreign-built cruisers in its navy, plus 5 cruisers built at home. We were making our own armour plate at Kure by then, and moving rapidly ahead in sea power. Great Britain had already noticed this and seized the chance in 1902 to effect a treaty with Japan. This action, taken only 35 years after Japan's fighting men gave up wearing helmets and armour like the Knights of the Crusades, signified her formal entrance into the society of modern nations. Because of the alliance with Japan, Great Britain needed to keep only a small naval force in the Far East, and could concentrate her main naval strength in the Mediterranean, where Germany was threatening. How right Britain was in this move was shown on May 27, 1905, when Admiral Togo eliminated the only other naval power that threatened Britain's interests in Asia, Russia. Submarines seemed ideally suited for defence of our island kingdom. Between 1905 and 1914, Japan bought them from Great Britain, France, Italy and Germany, finally basing her home-built submarines on the last, which were then the world's best. During that period, and for years afterward, Japan was truly the only sea power in the Orient. True, President Theodore Roosevelt sent his Great White Fleet around the world in a show of strength in 1901-08, but this impressed no one but the American newspapers. While the White Fleet cruised, Great Britain completed construction of HMS Dreadnought, which made Roosevelt's ships obsolete before they got home. Also, Japan's naval strategists noted something important about Roosevelt's force. Every bit of support for its 16 battleships had to be supplied by foreign ports and foreign ships. The Great White Fleet could not carry enough of its own fuel to fight a war with Japan. The White Fleet, in fact, because it could not even steam from Hawaii to Japan and back without refueling, dictated Japanese naval strategy for the next 30 years. This was based on defeat of an approaching enemy by catching him with his fuel depleted, far from his support bases. Our defence strategy meant defence, not attack, which accents how novel and daring it was for us to attack Pearl Harbor. On April 14, 1910, the year in which I was born, Lieutenant Sakuma took submarine number 6, our submarines had numbers only until 1923, out on special trials. He was experimenting with a forerunner of the famous Schnorkel, just as Mr. Holland had. Sakuma wanted to be able to operate submerged while his gasoline-powered engine breathed air from the surface. But his boat took a sudden dip and water flooded in through his crude air intake. Before it could be closed, submarine number 6 was so weighted down with water that it sank. When it was finally raised and the dead bodies taken from it, this memorial written by Lat Sakuma was found. It is regrettable that because of carelessness on the part of the captain of the ship, Sakuma himself, Orita, His Imperial Majesty's ship was sunk and the crew members are about to die. All hands remained at their stations and worked calmly as death approached them. We are not afraid to die doing our duty, but we do fear that this accident may make Japan hesitate to continue further efforts to advance the development of submarines. Do not misunderstand. We beg you. Please continue the effort. The cause of sinking was that, while navigating submerged and using the intake pipe, we went too deep and water came in through the pipe. We tried to close the valve in a hurry, but it jammed. Water filled the after compartments, and we began sinking with the stern down at an angle of 25 degrees. Time, 10:40 a.m. After sinking, the boat came to rest with the bow up at an angle of about 13 degrees. Batteries were covered with water and all lights went out. We began blowing the main ballast tank as soon as the submarine started down, but have been using the hand pump since the electricity failed. Not much result. The time is now 11:45, and I am writing this in the conning tower. As submariners, we must be very careful, but at the same time we must be bold if the submarine is to make progress. I have always reminded my men not to be overcautious. Some may laugh at today's failure, but I still think my warnings were correct. Submarines must have the best possible crews. I am satisfied with the crew I had. All worked well and stood to their stations. And now I make my public will. I humbly address myself to His Majesty. Please take good care of the families my crew members leave behind. That is the only thought that concerns me at this moment. Time is 12:30. It is now very difficult to breathe. I am affected by gasoline fumes. Time is 12:40. Signed, Tsutomu Sakuma. Toyama and I were very much moved by this memorial. A lot had been learned about submarines since Sakuma's death, and we both knew that a very simple safety device on his breathing tube would have eliminated the cause of his death. Still, his will exemplified what we admired most in Imperial Navy officers: courage, concern for subordinates, devotion to the Emperor, and calmness in the face of death. These were the marks of a true samurai. At that moment, we both decided that we wanted to be submarine men. We both eventually got our wish. While I studied at Etajima, the naval might of Japan grew. In 1928, the first Nachi-class cruiser was laid down, a ship superior to many of her foreign counterparts. In that same year, Japan completed the first of the Fubuki-class destroyers, of which she built 24 in the next 5 years. These displaced 1980 tons and could make the exceptional speed of 37 knots. At launching, they were the world's largest, fastest, and most powerful destroyers, with 3 triple torpedo tubes for firing 9 tin fish, plus 6 spare torpedoes, as their main armament. In 1930, the London Naval Conference was held. Our country was given parity with Great Britain and the US in cruisers. Japan laid down Mogami and Mikuma as light cruisers, bearing 15 6-inch guns each. This move made America and England hurry ahead with construction of light cruisers to offset these. The foreigners had no idea that the Mogami class would be pulled into shipyards years later and fitted with the 8-inch, longer-ranged gun batteries for which they had originally been designed. In 1931, 2 things happened that were of great importance to me. Japan began scrapping her old submarines. The old ones had to be scrapped so we could stay within the treaty submarine strength of 52,700 tons. And I graduated from Etajima. 9 submarines were laid down in 1931 as part of what was called the First Replenishment Plan. 6 were of the fleet type, I-68 to I-73, later given numbers 700 higher. 1 was a cruiser type, I-6, and 2 others were what we called medium type 2. They were RO-33 and RO-34. The larger submarines were intended to have a surface speed of 24 knots, in conformance with the strategic doctrine of having them engage an enemy far at sea. My 59th class graduated from Etajima on November 16, 1931, 2 months after the Mukden Railway incident in Manchuria. This incident involved Japan in a war with China that did not end for 14 years. It only ended when we were defeated by the Americans. About the time I began my first training cruise in the old cruiser Asama, a veteran of the Tsushima battle, American Secretary of War Stimson announced a non-recognition policy toward the state of Manchukuo, which Japan had set up. My country was defended in her action by the Hearst Press in America, which pointed out to Mr. Stimson the similarities between Japan's acquisition of Manchukuo and the way the US had seized Texas from Mexico. Throughout the 30s, men of our Foreign Office often succeeded in enraging American diplomats by using terms of historic significance whenever speaking. Once was in December 1934, when Japan said she wanted naval parity with the US and Great Britain for prestige and manifest destiny. Mr. Cordell Hull turned livid at this, although men who held his very office 100 years earlier had often used the phrase to justify America's movement westward into the great prairie areas belonging to others. And Mr. Hull also became very upset when Japan declared a Monroe Doctrine for Asia, objecting to Western domination of China and asserting that she, Japan, was assuming sole responsibility for keeping peace in the Orient. Our Foreign Minister Matsuoka pricked American consciences too by stating, "Japan is expanding, and what country in its expansion period had ever failed to be trying to its neighbors? Ask the American Indian or the Mexican how excruciatingly trying the young United States was once upon a time. I am neither a politician nor a diplomat. I cite things like those above to show how the great naval powers succeeded only in alienating one another more and more during the 10 years preceding the Pacific War. Japan felt that she deserved a place in the Asia Sun because of the great strides she had made since 1868. Isoroku Yamamoto, our great admiral, put our country's position neatly at one of the disarmament conferences when, as a captain and a delegate, he objected to the 5-5-3 ratio, under which Japan was to have only 60% of the capital ships allowed each to England and the US. At one of the evening dinners given after day-long discussions, Yamamoto toyed with his fork and said, "Although I am smaller, I am not asked to eat only 2/3 as much." Among Japan's immediate observations after Commodore Perry forced open a door she'd kept shut nearly 250 years was that the Western countries profited greatly from the weak ones they entered. She did not intend to let it happen to her. During the 30s, she also felt that Great Britain, America and Holland were trying to close her in again, shutting her off from the modern age and all of its opportunities. In all dealings during the 30s, neither side would concede the least thing to the other. Instead, each concentrated more on inflaming the minds of its citizens than on making peaceful overtures and compromises. This eventually led the way to the awful Pacific War, for which all countries involved must accept a share of the blame. Such thoughts were certainly not in my mind when I stepped aboard Osama. Since 1902, when Japan and Great Britain signed a mutual defense treaty, America had been for strategic planning purposes our most logical enemy. And since Japan felt England had betrayed her at the 1922 Naval Disarmament Conference, Britain was from that time considered an ally of America rather than of Japan. My task in those days was simple, requiring no deep philosophical thinking. As a past midshipman, my job was to prepare myself to be commissioned an ensign, an officer prepared to defend his country against an enemy coming from the east. I looked forward eagerly to my first tour at sea. It proved to be disappointing. Shipboard life was not bad, but because of the fighting in Manchuria, we were looked upon with cold eyes when we made port in Korea, Dairen, Port Arthur, Tsingtao, and Shanghai. People on the continent had no love for my country. My second training cruise was a little better, although British authorities would allow no Japanese sailors to go ashore at Singapore. They didn't want us to get a glimpse of the great new base they were building there. At Manila, we exchanged formal greetings with American Army and Navy men, but at Hong Kong, the Chinese population raised such fierce opposition that the British refused us shore leave at that Crown colony. The South Seas, however, extended its traditional hospitality. We sailed completely around the continent of Australia, making stops at Fremantle, Adelaide, Melbourne, Sydney and Hobart in Tasmania. Our training fleet, under Vice Admiral Nobujiro Imamura, also visited Wellington, New Zealand. Official welcomes were stiff and formal, but private ones were something else again. Our first contact with a white nation made a favourable impression on us, chiefly because Rotary Club members in each port went far out of their ways to show us a warm welcome. We visited Truk, Saipan and the Fijis on our northward trip home. A very curious thing happened in Suva, the Fiji's capital. Besides the British Governor-General and the Mayor, who declared a holiday in honour of our visit, the native Papuan chief visited our flagship. My classmate, Midshipman Minoru Yonehara, was assigned to escort the chief's eldest daughter around the Asama. This lovely girl spoke excellent English, but Yonehara's was somewhat halting because we had very little chance to practice our school-learned language, except on one another. The young lady became so absorbed in conversation with my friend, who stood 6 feet tall, remarkable for a Japanese in those days, and whose skin was almost as brown as her own, that she tripped over a projection on the main deck. It cut an ugly gash in her bare foot. Hotoke-sama, Yonehara, the nickname we gave the contemplative midshipman because of his Buddha-like characteristics, showed his gentlemanly breeding and training at once. He whipped out his handkerchief, bound the young lady's foot, and picked her up in his arms. He dashed for sick bay, where the doctor treated the wound. Then the visitors left the ship. On the very next day the chief's servant appeared on board, his face very serious, and asked to see Kaptegi Kasuya, CO of Asama. He told our commanding officer that his master had been very impressed with the gallant and knightly conduct of Yonehara. The chief very much wanted the midshipman as a bridegroom for his eldest daughter. Captain Kasuya could not believe his ears. At first he thought it was simply the chief's method of expressing his appreciation of Yonehara's behaviour. He interpreted the statement merely as a very sincere compliment. As the conversation continued, though, he realized the messenger was fully serious. What to do? Captain Kasuya at once consulted with vice-admirals, Imamura, and with Imamura's staff. All agreed that this was indeed an unprecedented happening in the Imperial Navy. For one thing, Japanese naval officers were not allowed to marry foreigners. They weren't even allowed to marry Japanese without the permission of the Navy Minister. But the naval officers surely could not offend their host by telling them that. All they could do was keep talking graciously, hoping some way out could be found. The servant went on to say that his master desired Midshipman Yonehara to leave the ship, marry his daughter, and succeed to the rule of the Fijians. Aha, Yonehara was called, and answered this for himself. He extended his regrets, but stated he could not leave his ship and the navy because he had given his solemn oath to defend his native land by service at sea. He could not break his oath to his homeland, could he? The chief understood this kind of talk. He appreciated Yonehara's love of country. On our sailing day, the same servant reappeared. With him he had a beautifully woven mat. "It is the gift of my master," he said. "Only a man fit to rule in Fiji may sit on it." After that, we no longer called Yonehara Hotoke-sama. We called him Wakashucho, young tribe master. One officer had been in favour of Yonehara's staying at Suva. He foresaw war with the whites one day, and felt that a Japanese man holding an influential position at Suva could be of great help and a source of valuable information in the future. Perhaps Yonehara might have been happy at Suva too. In true Japanese tradition, he was later to lose his life near the scene of this incident. We returned to Japan in July. The following month I was transferred to the heavy cruiser Haguro, a proud ship. Duty in the battleship Mutsu followed that, during which tour I was able to keep that boyhood promise to myself by touching her imperial crest, and was commissioned as an ensign. I then spent a year in destroyer Keiki before getting orders to submarine school, where I trained in RO-27, an 800-ton boat. I was to have duty in 5 more submarines, a cruiser and a destroyer before getting my own command, but I was well prepared for it by then, having served as navigator in I-7 and I-152, and as executive officer torpedo officer in RO-33, I-160 and I-15. Now, in 1942, I had my own ship, a fine new boat of 601 tons displacement, the submarine RO-1001. The RO-100 class of submarines consisted of 18 boats. All had been built as part of the Imperial Navy's 4th replenishment plan, originated in 1939 and revised in 1940. It included 1 sub of the I-9 class, 14 of the I-75 class, 10 of a new I-176 class, 9 of the RO-35 class, and 9 of our class. Our construction group was labelled Submarine Small and numbered from 100 so as not to confuse them with the fast production RO-35 class, which were a third again our size at 1,000 tons. The RO-100 class was to perform good service for Japan, although all would be lost during the war. Anxious to get her finished, I took over RO-101 while she was still under construction. Her length was 200 feet, her range 50–60 miles at 12 knots. All 4 tubes were in the bow, and she carried a load of 8 torpedoes. Top surface speed was 14.2 knots, underwater speed 8 knots. We had no deck gun, only a pair of 25mm machine guns forward of the bridge. RO-101's underwater endurance was 60 hours at 3 knots, and she could dive safely only to 250 feet. Though small, she was a good boat for short-range operations. I knew we'd see combat in her not long after she was finished. The RO-100 class was designed for the defence of the mandated islands. After Midway, it became more and more certain that fighting would move to that area. We had a base set up at Truk and another at Rabaul. I would be heading for one of them as soon as our shakedown training was finished. I was still overseeing details of RO-101's final construction when men in Washington, D.C. came to a decision that would make Solomons a fiery chapter in the world's history. Based on a report that an American aircraft had sighted airfield construction at Guadalcanal Island, the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff ordered the island's seizure before the airfield could be completed and used against U.S. forces. The 8th Fleet of Japan, called the Outer South Seas Defence Fleet, was activated at Rabaul on New Britain Island not long afterward. It was under Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, who had led the battleship cruiser portion of the force that had attacked Pearl Harbor. Soft-spoken, intelligent and courteous, Mikawa was held in high esteem. To back him up and to oversee submarine operations against Australia, the 6th Fleet's headquarters was moved from Kwajalein to Truk. In the Aleutians, I-1 through I-7 of Subron 2 had moved up to relieve the boats that had gone there with the assault force in May. At home, a 5th replenishment plan had been altered somewhat. We called ship construction plans replenishment plans, under the grand strategy of replacing our entire fleet with more modern vessels we hoped could cope with those of US and Great Britain. A new plan had been put forward, to construct mammoth plane-carrying submarines with the ability to cruise completely around the world. Each of these would be able to cruise from Japan down around the Cape of Good Hope and into the Atlantic with ease. They could then take stations off places like New York and Washington, D.C., and launch airstrikes at the enemy's chief city and his capital, a total of 18 such submarines, largest ever built until America in 1958 launched the large nuclear submarine Triton, were authorized. They were the I-400 class, again numbered so as not to be confused with any others. Besides this long-range plan, submarines had to be built for it first. A similar mission to bomb the US, but much sooner, was approved. In the first week of August, the American Marines landed on Guadalcanal. In its third week, Dr. Meiji Tagami left Yokosuka with I-25. On board was Warrant Flying Officer Nobuo Fujita, the only man ever to bomb the United States. Chapter 8. America in the Solomons. Fujita over Oregon. After the Midway operation, Japanese submarines were recalled and deployed to other areas than the Eastern Pacific. Subron 2, as I said, went to the Aleutians. Most of the submarines not in home waters were operating off Australia, in the Bay of Bengal, off Suez, and in the Indian Ocean. We had nothing near the Solomons Bismarck's area except RO-33 and RO-34. On Guadalcanal, work was moving ahead rapidly with the airstrip. Nearly 2,600 men were labouring there, with 400 riflemen forming the garrison to protect them against sudden raids. The airfield, which could accommodate 60 aircraft, was to be ready by the end of August. At that time, the 26th Air Flotilla was to move in and begin operating from the field. But plans went awry. Early in the morning of August 7, 1942, an American amphibious force crept around the western end of Guadalcanal under cover of poor weather and awakened our troops there and at Tulagi, an island to the north, with a salvo of gunfire. Vastly outnumbered, our men retreated into the jungle. The Americans put 10,000 Marines ashore before nightfall, 25 times the number of fighting men we had on that doomed island. Our 25th Air Flotilla, then based at Rabaul and awaiting relief, flew a strike down the 650-mile-long slot, the route between New Britain and Guadalcanal. Wanted by Australian coast watchers, American carrier planes were waiting for them. Our fighter planes gave good account of themselves, but our ambushed bombers suffered severe losses while doing little damage to the enemy's ships. Admiral Mikawa, who had the 8th Fleet, was at this time in Rabaul, with some of his cruisers away at Cavien, New Ireland. So little indication did we have of a possible enemy attack on the Solomons, that these cruisers, the bulwark of any defence against such a move, were refuelling at Cavien for a trip westward to Manus in the Admiralty Islands. Mikawa hastily summoned the cruisers to join him, sent messages to all available submarines to move into stations around Guadalcanal, and set out to do what damage he could do to the enemy fleet. He left St. George's Channel in the afternoon of August 7th, with cruisers Kako, Furutaka, Kinugasa, Aoba, Chokai, Yubari, and Tenryu, plus the destroyer Unagi. In spite of being spotted almost at once, and at least twice en route, he bored into Sea Lark Channel in the early hours of Ogham 9 and began shooting. Mikawa's sailors sank 3 American cruisers, USS Quincy, USS Vincennes, USS Astoria, and the Australian cruiser Canberra. They also damaged a 5th cruiser. He intended to race on past these guardians and demolish the transports moored off the Guadalcanal and Tulagi beaches after that, but in the melee his ships became scattered. Fearing that reassembling them, attacking the enemy's amphibious force, then retreating past Savo Island would take too long, Mikawa then broke off his attack. He headed back for Rabaul, trying to get out of carrier aircraft range before dawn. He couldn't know, of course, that the American carrier admiral had pulled his flat tops out of the area so hurriedly that he would later suffer censure, undeserved, for it. So, due to a combination of poor performance, poor communications, poor deployment, and poor preparations by the enemy, coupled with the excellent marksmanship and high state of training of the 8th Fleet, we inflicted on a superior U.S. force the worst defeat the American Navy had suffered in 125 years. Japan's name for this victorious engagement was the First Battle of the Eastern Solomons. Americans called it Savo Island. On August 17, the Americans put 2 of their mine-laying submarines to unusual use. A force of 222 Marines under Lieutenant Colonel Carlson went ashore from the USS Nautilus and USS Argonaut at Makin Island in the Gilberts. This raid was intended to divert our attention from the Allied operations in the Solomons, but of course it did not. Anyone who owned a chart of the Pacific Ocean could tell what the Americans intended to do: island hop up the Solomons and Bismarck's island chains toward Japan. In fact, General Howland M. Smith, USMC, called the Makin Island raid a blunder in a book he later wrote. All it accomplished, he said, was to make Japan worried about her island holdings in the Gilberts, with the result that she fortified them heavily, which cost the lives of many Marines in November of 1943. Our submarines began moving into the Solomons area to help with its defence. RO-33 and RO-34 took stations, as did I-121, I-122 and I-123. These were buttressed by I-9, I-15, I-17, I-19 and I-26. The new submarines I-31 and I-33 also went into the Solomons, and I-11, I-174 and I-175 moved up from the east coast of Australia. The majority of these boats concentrated southeast of Guadalcanal, where they could report and intercept any Allied ships bringing reinforcements to the island. I-9 tried to attack USS Enterprise, but was sighted by 3 destroyers and was herself attacked. She got away. I-17 was also attacked and suffered some damage, but she also escaped destruction. By mid-August, the Americans had their situation well defined. They had to stay on Guadalcanal Island, keep and complete the airfield that was 90% finished when they landed, then use it to provide air support when they later moved further up the chain. It had a second value too, so long as they kept it. We could not use it for harassing their South Seas shipping from the air. The problem of the Japanese Army and Navy, of course, was to dislodge these Marines and take back the island. About 1,000 Japanese troops were quickly put ashore, the High Command thinking that this number, together with the troops already there, were sufficient to do the job of driving the Marines into the sea. They were wrong. Marines outnumbered our forces very heavily at that time and very nearly wiped out the entire reinforcing group within 48 hours of its arrival. ADM Yamamoto then decided to send in a larger force, while at the same time sweeping the surrounding seas of any enemy naval strength. On Truk, he had 5,000 troops, intended earlier for landing at Midway. He put about 1,500 of these in ships and sent them south toward Guadalcanal. To make sure they got there without interference, he dispatched a total of 3 battleships, 3 aircraft carriers, 12 cruisers and 25 destroyers to screen and defend them, as well as to sink any American ships that might try to interfere. The carriers were under Vice Admiral Nagumo. He split one of them, Ryujo, off from the force, sending her out as a decoy. While she drew American carrier aircraft to her, planes from Zuikaku and Shokaku would be free to attack the American flat-tops. Our battleships and cruisers were to dash in and bombard Henderson Field, the name Americans had given our airstrip, wrecking it and the planes stationed there. This would preclude any land-based counter-attack. Our land-based planes at Rabaul would also attack Henderson Field, after which our transports would go in and land troops. Our submarines gave early warning of the enemy, having sighted a striking force south of Guadalcanal, but our attempt to reinforce the island was turned back, with the loss of carrier Ryujo and destroyer Mutsuki. We also lost RO-33, I-123 and RO-61 within a few days, though I-123 was the only loss directly in the Guadalcanal area. She was scouting when on AUG 28, the old American destroyer Gamble, which had been converted into a mine layer, sighted her shortly after 8 a.m. The location was Indispensable Strait, a body of water separating the eastern end of Guadalcanal and Malaita. Gamble kept attacking with depth charges until noon. Litzeskirkter Makoto Nakai and all hands in I-123 were lost. During the final week of August, what Americans came to call the Tokyo Express began steaming out of Rabaul. Made up of groups of Japanese destroyers, it usually left in the afternoon, running along the north side of the island chain that day and most of the next. Then, on the second night out of port, it would make a high-speed run into the western end of Guadalcanal. It would land troops in the middle of the night and speed away northwestward to get out of range of American aircraft by daylight. Several thousand men were put ashore on Guadalcanal by this method between August 29 and Sept 7. While this was going on, Dr. Meiji Tagami's I-25 was cruising to a point off the Oregon coast, not far north of the California-Oregon border. On the morning of Sept 9, Tagami's aircraft pilot, Warrant Flying Officer Nobuo Fujita, was sitting on his bunk, cleaning his pistol in an effort to while away waiting time. Fujita was to do something no one had ever done before or has done since: bomb the United States. Fujita had been conscripted into the Navy from his home village in 1932, when our military forces began an extensive expansion program. He had been a pilot for about 9 years when the war started, with 3,500 hours in his flight log, much of it in combat over China. In 1935, he had been a test pilot with Litter Minoru Genda, helping check out experimental aircraft that later became our first-line planes. Fujita was promoted to warrant officer grade and ordered to duty on board I-23 in September 1941. He was transferred to I-25 a short time later and began intensive drills. During these, he was catapulted from I-25 at night and sent out to locate enemy forces composed of our own warships. He would approach these from the down-moon side and radio their positions to his mothership. He flew a Type 96 biplane with floats. This aircraft was a development perhaps peculiar to Japan, our Navy having considered the idea of mounting aircraft on submarines as early as 1922. The following year, a Heinkel U-1 was purchased from Germany and experiments began. 2 years later, in 1925, we had a plane of our own, developed from the German one. It was test-flown, using the mine-laying submarine I-121 as its sea base. Our plane was called Yoko Type 1 and was of unusual construction in that it was a biplane with no struts between its wings. Yoko could make 70 knots with its 80 HP engine, and its endurance was about 2 hours airtime. From this plane was later developed the Type 91 small seaplane. It was the one flown from I-5 in 1936 during fleet manoeuvres, though no catapult was used, the plane being lowered into the water for takeoff. In that same year, the Type 96 floatplane was accepted by the Navy Ministry after testing by Lotte Kunihiro, who later became a general officer in Japan's Air Self-Defense Force. From that year on, it was the only type aircraft flown from our submarines. It was called Geta because its floats so resembled Japanese footwear. For storage purposes, the Type 96 submarine scout plane could be disassembled into 12 separate parts: wings, fuselage, tail, floats, etc., and quickly assembled again. It was stored in 2 hangars in I-7 class boats, or in a single hangar on I-9 and I-15 classes. I was attached to I-7 as communications officer during her construction and witnessed many takeoffs and recoveries of this type plane. Fujita's crewman was Petty Officer Shoji Okuda. Together they made a number of daring flights in the first 9 months of the war, although they were cheated of a chance to fly over Pearl Harbor. I-25's station on Deck 7, 1941, was about 100 miles north by east of Pearl Harbor, and both men had hoped to be launched. But, while en route to their assigned station, the men of I-25 heard a thumping noise from the deck hangar as the boat ploughed through rough seas. Fujita cursed when the noise was investigated that night, when I-25 surfaced to charge batteries. The plane had not been properly secured in the hangar and was damaged beyond possible use. After successfully dodging 4 bombs dropped by planes of the USS Enterprise after the Pearl Harbor attack, I-25 went on to the US West Coast. Once, just after surfacing, she received a wireless report concerning some American transports, but these were too far away to pursue, whereupon Fujita got an idea. He discussed it with his executive officer, Lotte Tsukudo. Up until that time, submarine-borne planes carried no heavy armament. If our planes were armed with bombs, Fujita told Tsukudo, I could search far ahead of the submarine. I could not only locate enemy ships for I-25, but also join in attacks to sink them. Tsukudo was entranced with the idea, and the two went on to discuss how submarine-launched planes might attack the Panama Canal locks, blocking reinforcement from the Atlantic of America's Pacific Fleet. Or they could hit American aircraft factories on the west coast of the U.S. Tsukudo finally suggested that Fujita put his ideas into writing and forward them up the chain of command. A simple, modest man, Fujita was too shy to take such action. The subject was dropped while I-25 patrolled in the eastern Pacific, where she sank the SS Emidio on Decada 19. But they did talk it over on the way back to Kwajalein. And when Tsukudo left the ship for Submarine Commander's School in January, he had Fujita's written suggestion in his pocket. I-25 then went into the southern seas for 6 weeks, during which Fujita made 6 flights over enemy territory without mishap, although he almost missed finding the submarine on one return flight. Sea Dr. Tagami helped him on that occasion by exploding a yellow smoke bomb. Fujita, far to the north of his submarine, saw this and landed safely beside her a few minutes later. During February and March, the float plane, with Fujita and Okuda in it, made reconnaissances of Sydney and Melbourne, Australia, Hobart, Tasmania, and Auckland and Wellington, New Zealand, piercing the Allied defences without problem. In late March, they flew over Suva, in the Fijis, and had an amusing experience. On the way in, their plane was sighted, and a blinker light challenged them. "What should I do, sir?" said Okuda through the voice tube. "Send something back to him," said Fujita. He didn't dare take immediate flight, for fear enemy pursuit planes would chase after him. "What shall I send?" asked Okuda, his blinker lamp at the ready. Fujita got impatient as well as worried. "Send him anything!" he shouted. That's what Okuda did. Holding his blinker lamp over the side of the plane, he sent ... the Japanese code signal for anything. I-25 refueled at Truk and headed for Yokosuka, arriving there on April 5th. On May 11th, it put to sea again, heading for the Aleutians, where Fujita made a reconnaissance flight over Kodiak Harbour on May 27th, coming back with a report of 4 submarines, 3 destroyers and some fishing boats moored there. Sea Dr. Tagami's boat was back at Yokosuka again on July 10th. On July 27th, Fujita was mystified by a special wireless signal shown him by his commanding officer. "Warrant Officer Fujita is ordered to report to Imperial Naval Headquarters at once," it read. The puzzled flyer got into his best clean set of whites and caught a train to Tokyo, 1 hour's ride away, with instructions to report to Sea Dr. Shojiro Yura. He entered the old red brick building, found Yura's office, walked in and came to attention. "I am Warrant Flying Officer Fujita, sir," he said, "Chief Flying Officer of I-25. At that moment another door opened and a man walked in, wearing the uniform and insignia of a commander. Fujita recognized him at once as Prince Takamatsu, younger brother of the Emperor and an Etajima graduate. This so flustered the ex-farm boy that all he could think of to do was to sound off with his name and rank again. Prince Takamatsu quickly put him at ease, and the 3 men joined another at a table where some American charts were spread out. They had been captured at Wake Island and were of the U.S. West Coast. One of the officers ran his finger north along the coast of California and into Oregon. "We plan for you to bomb forest areas for us, Fujita," he said, "right about here." Fujita was stunned until things were explained to him. A member of Japan's diplomatic corps who had served in Seattle had written Captain Sadatoshi Tomioka in the operations section. He suggested that the American mainland might be bombed. Somewhere that letter had crossed paths with Fujita's letter, because Fujita, I-25 and Sea Dr. Tagami were mentioned by name in the final operational plan. On August 15, the same day I-26 left Yokosuka for the Solomons and Fame, Sea Dr. Tagami again took I-25 out of that port also. He headed east, Fujita's plane on board, newly fitted with bomb racks. On Sept 9, 1942, I-25 was in sight of Cape Blanco Lighthouse on the coast of Oregon and could see its beam. This surprised I-25's crew, because the war had been on for more than 9 months. They could not understand why the American High Command allowed such beacons to be lighted, serving as guides for an enemy. Fujita was summoned to the conning tower, and Sitta Tagami asked him to look through the periscope. Straight ahead lay the Oregon coastline, its inland mountains wreathed in haze and the white face of Cape Blanco just discernible through the early morning darkness. Fujita agreed that the seas had flattened enough to make launching operations feasible and went below to make final preparations. He put on his flight suit and went through a ceremony peculiar to the Japanese Navy. The Imperial Army, when possible, cremated its dead and sent their ashes to the homeland for delivery to relatives. But Navy men usually died in such ways that their bodies could not be recovered for cremation, so we followed a special custom. Fujita packed all of his belongings into one large box. In a smaller one he placed his will, a few strands of his hair, and some fingernail cuttings. If he died on his air mission, and I-25 returned safely to Japan, these remains would be placed in a special box of Polonia wood and presented to his family. That lightweight box would be honored in a small household niche, or botsudon, at his home for a long time, though the remains would be removed to the Fujita family grave after a while. These things done, Fujita went on deck and watched 7 special technicians get his plane ready. First, the hangar deck doors were swung open. Then men hauled on a line attached to the plane's fuselage. They tugged it forward until it rested on a small dolly that ran along rails to I-25's catapult. This was a swift, silent operation, with no one speaking while wings, stabilizers, rudder and pontoons were undamped from the hangar's inside walls and put in place. Men had to be both careful and speedy. No time could be wasted, because I-25 was most helpless at launching time. An enemy plane could destroy her easily. Once his plane was ready, Fujita got in, started his engine, checked meters and gauges, then got out and reported to the captain. "All is ready, sir," he told Tagami. The captain answered with, "Very well. Good luck, Fujita." A few minutes later, I-25's executive officer waved a flashlight in a circle, and the catapult was fired. Fujita and Okuda were away, en route to accomplish what no foreigner had done in America since 1814, when the British burned its capital. They would invade, attack, and escape. The sun, which had begun climbing as Fujita's plane did, filled the eastern sky with a red-gold brightness as he increased his altitude by 350 feet per minute. The Geta's 300 Hawaii P engine could only pull him along at 90 knots, and Fujita feared detection because it meant almost certain death. He flew about 50 miles inland and ordered Okuda to release the first bomb. "Okuda freed the one under my left wing," Fujita said when interviewed by Mr. Harrington, "and the remaining bomb's weight almost pulled us into a right-hand diving turn. I corrected this at once and looked below. Our bomb hit and burst, splashing a brilliant white light over the earthscape. Good, I thought. I had been moored near Shitose at Yokosuka on April 18th when one of Doolittle's bombers hit her, killing some men. Now I was returning the enemy's attack." Fujita had been worried about the bombs. Each weighed 154 pounds and was armed by a wind-spun propeller as it fell, and each carried 512 tiny firebombs in its thin casing. I-25 had taken 6 such bombs aboard at Yokosuka so that 3 missions could be flown. The bombs were designed to scatter the incendiary capsules upon impact, making a circle of fire 200 yards in diameter, with each tiny bomb burning at 2,000 degrees. Planners in Tokyo felt that this was certain to cause tremendous forest fires, and gave Fujita specific orders to drop them in unsettled areas only, distant from inhabitants, so they would have a good start before firefighters got to them. It was hoped that large fires would spread panic in Oregon and other forested areas. Public opinion might be aroused and a demand raised to pull back American ships from mid-Pacific operations to guard the shoreline against repeat attacks. I-25's pilot flew eastward for another 10 minutes and ordered the second bomb let go. Then he dived for the ground, leveling off at 100 feet and racing for the ocean, hoping to get back out to sea undetected. As Fujita passed over Capo Blanco, he saw 2 American merchant ships, both heading north, a few miles separating them. Diving until the wave-tops almost brushed his pontoons, he passed midway between the 2, hoping neither would recognize his plane as Japanese. His procedure called for him to return to I-25 along a bearing opposite to that along which he had left her, but when he found himself far south of the submarine, he had to go back and approach her again, alternately swooping and climbing as a recognition signal. He was alongside the boat before long and reported the two merchant vessels to Tagami after he told him his mission had been successful. Crewmen were still disassembling Fujita's plane for stowage as I-25 built up speed to 18 knots for a pursuit of the two merchant ships. But the plane had barely been stowed away when out of nowhere dived an American plane. It dropped 2 bombs, which fortunately missed, and Tagami dived his sub to 250 feet, shutting off engines after arriving at that level. Throughout the day, his crew could hear the detonations of depth charges, all of them far away. After sunset, Tagami surfaced and ran north at high speed to clear the search area. Several days later, he picked up a wireless report from Tokyo. It told of intercepting a San Francisco broadcast describing how an airplane, presumably Japanese, had dropped incendiary bombs upon Oregon forest areas, causing some casualties and much damage to the woodland. I-25 sank SS Commercial Trader 2606 tons on September 16, about 40 miles from Galera Point Lighthouse, British Columbia, and Tagami made other attacks, not all of them as successful, before turning south. He planned to have Fujita make his second flight over California's Redwood Forest, east of Cape Mendocino. But the seas there were found too rough for flight operations, so on September 29, at night I-25 was back near Cape Blanco. Conductor Tagami hoped to fool the Americans by striking twice in the same general area, but making the second attempt at night. Lieutenant Kazuo Fukumoto, executive officer, once more waved his red-lensed flashlight in circles. Once more Fujita was catapulted eastward. The moon was in the northwest over his left shoulder as he raced in over the coast, dropped 2 more firebombs, and sped back out to sea. He missed I-25 on his return trip, so he went back to Cape Blanco Lighthouse to re-establish his bearings and tried again. This time he remembered to compensate for the same error in his simple compass that made him miss his mothership off Australia months before. Keeping to the southward of where I-25 was supposed to be, Fujita finally picked her up in the moonlight's path by sighting an oil slick she was trailing. Tagami took time to congratulate Fujita before ordering the oil leak found and repaired. Then he continued to cruise off America, hoping to find shipping targets and a suitable place for a third bombing attack on the mainland. On Oct 5, he sank the 7238-ton tanker SS Larry Doheny between Seattle and San Francisco. He hit another ship next day, but it limped safely into port. On Oct 10, he sank SS Camden, 6653 tons, off Seattle. This left him with but a single torpedo remaining. At that point, he told Fujita that the Americans would be too alert for another air attack to be successful, and turned I-25's bow west. He fired his final torpedo at a pair of submarines the next day. They were on the surface, about 500 miles west of Seattle, moving side by side. The range was very short, less than a half mile, and Tagami reported a sure kill on his return to Japan. The US, right up until long after the war was over, denied losing a submarine on that date in that area. Even the famous American submariner and author, Captain Edward Beach, concluded that Tagami was mistaken. Beach wrote that it must have been USS Grunion, lost on July 30, 1942, that Tagami must have sunk during I-25's second of the 3 patrols she made along America's coast. Time proved Tagami correct, though it took 19 years doing so. In 1962, it was finally revealed that there had been a submarine sunk by I-25, on that date and at that place. But it was not American. It was Russian. Perhaps Russia did not want to admit that her submarines were visiting a country with which Japan was at war, while Japan and Russia had a non-aggression pact. The submarines L-15 and L-16, nonetheless, were en route from Vladivostok to San Francisco, according to the final account, when there was a monstrous explosion and L-16 disappeared. That was the submarine sunk by Tagami's I-25.